Picture this, you stood in a newsagent in 1998, you've got £5 in your pocket and a choice to make. You can buy a new bag of sweets and a comic that'll last you 20 minutes, or you can grab that glossy magazine with the plastic baggie stuck in the front. You choose the disc, you always choose the disc, because back then, gaming was a rich man's hobby, but the demo disc was the great equaliser. It didn't matter if you were skinned. For the price of a magazine, you were a king with 10 different kingdoms to explore, but these weren't just samples, they were high-stakes gambles. I still remember the sweat on my palms playing that Resident Evil 2 trial. You had 10 minutes, that was it. The game didn't care if you were scared. It didn't care if you wanted to soak in the atmosphere of the RPD station. The clock was a physical weight on your chest. You'd sprint past the zombies, fumbling with the tank controls, praying you'd make it in one room further than you did yesterday before the screen faded to black. It was a strange way to grow up. We became experts at the first level of games we would never ever own. We'd master the opening 3 minutes of a snowboarding game or a weird Japanese puzzler until we could play them with our eyes shut. We didn't need the full game to have a favourite. We were happy with the scraps because those scraps had more personality than most modern AAA releases. Think about the Silent Hill demo that came tucked inside Metal Gear Solid. You bought the tactical espionage action, but you stayed for the fog and the sirens. Or the director's cut of Resident Evil, which felt like a golden ticket because it let you see the future of survival horror months before anyone else. We were a generation of gamers raised on tasters, and honestly, I think we were better for it. We didn't have the budget to be picky, so we discovered everything. We were explorers of the unfinished. Welcome to the Demo Disc Paradox. I'm Parasan. Now, if you've been following the main project, you know I'm usually buried neck deep in the PSX index, trying to make sense of all 1,278 North American releases released on the PlayStation 1. In the UK, these were our lifeblood, whether it was the official PlayStation magazine or the weird unofficial ones that came with a cheat code book. These discs were how we decided what was worth our pocket money. But more than that, they were how we experienced games we had no business playing. I was never a pro gamer. I wasn't the kid who would breeze through a platformer or master a complex sim in an afternoon. I was just a kid who liked the variety. The demo disc was a safe place for people like me. You didn't have to be good at the game, because the game was going to end in 5 minutes anyway. You didn't have to worry about the game over screen, because you were just there to see the graphics, hear the music, and feel the rumble of the DualShock for the first time. It was a buffet where everything was free, provided you didn't mind leaving the table before the main course. As I go through the index now, I keep running into old friends. I'll boot up a game I haven't thought about in 20 years, and the moment the first level starts, my hands just remember what to do. Not because I own the game, I couldn't afford it, but because I played the demo until the disc scratched the bits. We're going to look at why that limited timed experience actually left a deeper mark on our brains than the 100-hour epics of today. thing about the demo disc was that it didn't allow you to be a snob. Today you've got trailers, reviews and Twitch streamers telling you exactly what a game is before you even touched it, but back then, you had a menu with 8 icons on it, and you were going to play every single one of them, even the ones you knew were absolutely rubbish. If you go to an all-you-can-eat and there's a tray of lukewarm spring rolls, you're probably going to eat one just because you've paid your tenner. The demo disc was exactly the same. You'd finish the Resident Evil 2 taster, and then instead of turning the console off, you'd think, well, I might as well see what this poi poi is all about. Or you'd spend 45 minutes trying to understand the Japanese horse racing sim because it was there and you'd already looked at the screenshots in the magazine. It forced a level of genre blindness that we've completely lost. I ended up playing sports games, extreme fishing sims, and abstract rhythm titles that I would never have glanced at in the shop. It was a chaotic mix of high-budget masterpieces and the Net Euros experiments. Those black disc indie games made by blokes in the bedrooms. You'd go from a cinematic polish of Metal Gear Solid to a game where you're a bipedal egg jumping on blocks, and you didn't question it, it was just the disc. That variety was a godsend for a kid who wasn't necessarily good at games. If a game was too hard, it didn't matter. You'd play it for 3 minutes, fail miserably, and just hop back to the menu for the next one. There was no shame in it. You weren't failing a game you'd spent 50 quid on. You were just sampling a flavour you didn't like. But the weirdest part, some of those lukewarm spring rolls actually became your favourites. You'd find yourself loading up a demo for a game like Cooler World, a game about a beach ball on a floating platform, more often than the actual blockbusters. You'd become the world expert on a 3-minute slice of a game you'd never see the full version of in your entire life. We were building these weird, fragmented identities based on whatever the editor of PlayStation Power decided to burn onto that month's CD. We weren't just players, we were accidental connoisseurs of the obscure, and looking back, that's probably why the PSX index doesn't feel as daunting as it should. My brain was already trained to jump from tactical shooters to a cartoon platformer every 10 minutes. I've been training for this project since I was 10 years old, one plastic sleeve at a time. There is no anxiety quite like the anxiety of a PlayStation demo timer. In a modern game, if you want to stop and look at the textures on a wall or watch the sunset, you can. But in 1998, if you stood still for too long in the Resident Evil 2 demo, you were literally burning money. You had 10 minutes to see the future of horror, and every second spent fumbling with the tank controls felt like a tragedy. This created a very specific frantic way of playing. You weren't playing for the story, you were playing for the distance. It turned every single demo into an unofficial speedrun. I remember sitting on the edge of the sofa, leaning into the CRT, my heart hammering as I tried to dodge every zombie, just to see what was behind the next corner before the screen turned to black. It was a high-stakes rush that the full games rarely matched. When you only have 3 minutes to experience a game like Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, you don't spend time learning the mechanics, you just mash the buttons and pray for a miracle. You'd find a specific line or a specific trick that worked, and you'd do it over and over again, trying to beat your own high score in a window of time shorter than a pop song. It taught us to be efficient. It taught us that the first level of a game wasn't just an introduction, it was the entire world. And the end of the demo screen, that was the ultimate villain. It would always pop up right as you were about to do something incredible. You'd be mid-jump, mid-fight, or just about to solve a puzzle, and then bam, available now at all retailers. It was the ultimate tease. It left you with this lingering, itchy feeling of unfinished business. For a kid with limited money and had to be very selective about buying full-price games, that unfinished feeling lasted for years. I spent decades wondering what happened after the timer of some of those games. My imagination filled in the gaps with things far more terrifying and elaborate than what was actually in the full retail release. The pressure of the timer didn't just make us play faster, it made us dream bigger. We weren't just playing snippets of code, we were playing the trailers for our own hypothetical adventures. We became the experts at the sprint, We knew every pixel of those opening levels because we had to. We'd squeeze every drop of value out of those 3 minutes until the disc literally gave up. We were a generation raised on the short, sharp shock, and it gave us a focus that I think is completely missing from the 100-hour open world marathons of today. We didn't need forever, we just needed 1 more minute.
Big boom! Big boom!
If you grew up with siblings in a house with only one PlayStation, the demo disc wasn't just a toy, it was a diplomatic crisis. We had a very strict set of unwritten rules in our house, the older brother protocol, and when it came to a 10-minute demo, those rules became absolute law. In a full game, you could afford to be generous. Go on then, you have a go on Crash, I'll watch. But when the timer was ticking, generosity was dead. If you only had one shot at the Resident Evil 2 demo before tea, you weren't handing the controller over for anything. Every second your little brother spent walking into a wall or staring at a menu was a second of your life you were never getting back. It was the only time in my childhood where I felt a genuine adult sense of time management. The protocol dictated that the most skilled person in the room held the pad. It was a meritocracy born from scarcity. If I knew I could get to Kendo's gun shop in 3 minutes, but me mate or me brother would get stuck on the first zombie, they were relegated to the spectator seat. We'd sit there, 3 or 4 of us huddled around a tiny screen, shouting instructions like we were in a NASA control room. Left, no the other left, use the herb, skip the cutscene. We became a collective brain. Because we couldn't all play, we all invested everything into the one person who was. We learned the layout of the games through proxy. I knew the map of the Silent Hill school before I ever laid a finger on the D-pad. Just from watching the protocol in action, it turned a hobby into a team sport. And God help you if you was the one playing and you messed up. If you died 2 minutes into a 5-minute demo, the shame was unbearable. You'd have to pass the controller over while the game over screen mocked you. Knowing you'd just wasted the group's taster for the hour, it taught us a weird kind of discipline. You didn't play for fun, you played for the honour of the room. Looking back, it's one of the things I miss most. Now everyone has their own screen, their own console, and an infinite library of games they'll never finish. There's no scarcity anymore, so there's no protocol. We've lost the shared intensity of 4 kids staring at a timer, praying that the person with the controller doesn't mess it up. We were a unit, bound together by a purple bottom disc and a 10-minute dream. Every now and then, you'd be scrolling through the demo menu, past the Tomb Raiders and the Tekkens, and you'd find a section that felt like it belonged in a different magazine entirely. These were the Net Yaroze games. For those who don't know, the Net Yaroze games was a special black-coloured PlayStation that allowed hobbyists to program their own games at home. And for us kids, it was our first taste of what we now call indie games. But back then, they just felt like the weird stuff. These games didn't have the cinematic polish of a Capcom or a Konami title. They usually had no music or a single looping MIDI track that would bleed into your brain like an earworm. They featured bipedal legs, abstract shapes and gravity-defying physics. Games like Terra Incognita, Psychon, they were rough, they were glitchy, and they were absolutely fascinating because they felt obscure. When you played a big budget demo, you were seeing a corporate product, but when you played the Net Yaroze games, you were playing something a bloke called Mitsuru or Ben had made in a spare room. You could feel the human residue in the code. There was no hurdle management here. These games were often brutally hard or confusingly simple because there was no marketing team telling the developer to make it accessible. I remember spending hours on a game where you just had to move a block through a maze, or a top-down shooter that felt like it was held together with spit and a prayer. They were digital experiments. It showed us that the PlayStation wasn't just a toy for the giants, it was a canvas for the rest of us. It gave the console a soul that the Sega Saturn or the N64 struggled to match. It felt like the Wild West, and because these games were so small, They were often the only ones on the disc that weren't timed. You could play Rock and Gems for hours if you wanted to. It was the ultimate irony. We'd spend 5 minutes on a £1 million blockbuster and then spend the rest of the afternoon obsessed with a homemade clone of Balderdash. These black disc ghosts are a huge part of why I wanted to do the PSX Index. I wanted to find that spark of amateur creativity again in a world of 4K textures and microtransactions. There's something incredibly refreshing about an egg jumping on a platform just because someone thought it would be a laugh to code it. It reminds us that at the end of the day, games aren't made by studios, they're made by people. If you close your eyes and think about a demo disc, you don't hear the games, you hear the menu. That specific lo-fi, bass-heavy industrial techno that seemed to be the universal language of the late 90s. It was the sound of the future, or at least what a group of developers in 1997 thought the future was going to sound like. It was moody, it was aggressive, it had this muffled underwater quality that felt like you were eavesdropping on a rave happening in the basement of a skyscraper. In the UK, the official PlayStation magazine menus were legendary for this. You'd sit there for 20 minutes without even picking a game, just letting that loop wash over the room while you read the manual or argued about who was going to go first. It wasn't just a UI, it was an atmosphere. The music reflected the hardware. It was gritty and unpolished, much like the PS1 wobble we've talked about before. It had a digital grit to it. Most of these tracks were simple loops, probably knocked together in a weekend, but they had more personality than most modern orchestral scores. They made the act of choosing a game feel like you were hacking into a mainframe. You weren't just the kid in a bedroom, you were an operator. And then there were the visuals. The way the icon would spin, the high contrast blues and oranges, the jagged fonts that looked like they'd been cut out of a magazine with a pair of rusty scissors. Everything about the demo disc interface shouted extreme. It was the era of the X games, neon coloured energy drinks and chewed. The menu was the gateway to that world. Sometimes, the menu music was better than the demos themselves. You'd load up a disc, hear that heavy breakbeat start up, and you'd feel a rush of adrenaline. It set the tone. It told you that whatever was on the disc, whether it was a masterpiece or a pile of rubbish, it was going to be an experience. It was the sonic equivalent of that new game smell. I miss that edge nowadays. Console menus are clean, silent and clinical. They're designed to be invisible. But the PS1 demo menus wanted to be seen. They wanted to be heard. They were the sound of a decade that didn't know how to be quiet. They were the heartbeat of the console, a constant thumping reminder that you were part of a 32-bit revolution. The strangest thing about being a demo disc collector was that you were essentially a historian of things that never actually happened. We were playing versions of games that were still in flux. Because these discs had to be pressed and shipped months before a game's release, we were often playing builds that were held together with digital masking tape and a prayer. This created the vaporware ghost. You'd play a demo, let's say for a platformer or a racer, and you'd fall in love with a specific mechanic, a certain piece of music, or even a glitch that made the game feel unique. But then, 6 months later, you'd finally get your hands on the full retail copy, and it was different. The music had been replaced by something safer, the physics had been fixed, and the human residue of that early experimental build had been polished away by a corporate QA team. In some cases, the games never arrived at all. There were demos for titles that just vanished into the ether, leaving you with a 5-minute slice of a world that would never be finished. You were holding the fossil of a dead species. I remember playing demos for games that looked like they were going to change everything, only to find out years later they'd been cancelled due to licensing issues or a studio going bust. It gave the PlayStation library a sense of mystery. In the pre-internet age, if a game on a demo disc didn't show up in your local Virgin Megastores or HMV, you didn't know why. You just assumed it was coming soon. You'd keep that demo disc for years, loading it up every few months just to visit that ghost world one more time. It was like having a key to a house that had been demolished. This is where the architecture of the struggle comes back in. Seeing those early unpolished versions of games like Silent Hill or Metal Gear Solid makes you realise how close they came to being something completely different. You can see the rough edges, you can see the developers trying to figure out the limits of the hardware. For the PSX Index, these ghosts are vital. They remind us that for every one of those 1,278 games that made it to the shelf, there were dozens of ideas that died on the demo disc. We weren't just playing samples, we were playing the dreams that didn't quite make it. We were the only witnesses to a version of history that the retail market eventually forgot.
Welcome to the pizza-powered PlayStation giveaway. Grab that scratch and win card that comes with this CD and scratch away because you can win some very cool stuff, including PlayStation game consoles, video games, and a grand prize of $200,000. So give it a shot.
There was a hidden danger to the demo disc that the suits at the big publishers eventually caught on to: the good enough paradox. Sometimes a demo was so perfectly curated and gave you so much freedom that it actually killed any desire to buy the full release. Why drop 50 quid when the 5-minute taster gave you everything you actually wanted? The ultimate example of this was the original Grand Theft Auto. I remember the demo clearly. It gave you a 10-minute timer and dropped you into a living, breathing city. Now the full game had a story, missions and multiple cities, but as a kid, I couldn't have cared less about the plot. The fun wasn't the missions, it was the mayhem. We'd huddle around the TV, taking turns to see who could survive a 5-star police chase the longest before the timer hit 0. It was the perfect spectator sport. One person would be driving, 3 others would be shouting directions. And the moment that timer ran out or you ended up in a heap of twisted metal, the controller was passed on. We did this for hours, for months. We saw no reason to go out and buy the real release because everything we needed, the cars, the sirens and the carnage, was right there on that purple bottom disc. We'd played the game to death without ever owning a retail copy. This created a genuine confidence crisis for the industry. You'd save up for months, finally walk into a shop to buy the full version of a game, only to realise that the taster had already given you the best bits. The full game often felt like a chore compared to the high intensity spirit of the demo. You'd sit there in front of your CRT, realising the fun part of those shared afternoons with your mates was worth more than the 40 hours of padding the full game was trying to sell you. In the PSX Index, I run into this constantly. I'll boot up a game and realise that my entire memory of it is just the first level played 500 times. But that's the beauty of it. The demo disc allowed us to love the games for their core hook, rather than the longevity. It taught us that sometimes 10 minutes of pure, unadulterated chaos is better than 100 hours of a story you're never going to finish anyway. Let's be real for a second. The PlayStation was a middle-class luxury, but the demo disc was a working-class salvation. If you grew up in a house where big purchases only happened at Christmas or birthdays, you weren't part of the gaming conversation, you were just a spectator. But the magazine discs changed the math. They were the free-to-play model before the internet turned that concept into a marketplace for microtransactions. For the price of a couple of bags of chips, you had access to cutting edge. It didn't matter if your trainers were falling apart or if your school bag was a hand-me-down. When you booted up that disc, you were playing the same Resident Evil 2 trial as the kid in the posh house 3 streets over. It levelled the playing field, it gave us a shared language. We would talk about the T-Rex in the tech demo or the Metal Gear Solid docks because we'd all been there, even if we hadn't paid the entry fee. This accessibility sparked a level of discovery that I don't think we'll ever see again. Today, algorithms feed you more of what you already like. If you play a shooter, you get more shooters. But the demo disc was a chaotic, random delivery system. It didn't care about your user profile. It just threw a racing game, a rhythm game, and a 3D platformer and told you to deal with it. I discovered some of my favourite genres purely by accident because of those discs. I had never have asked for a game like Cooler World or Karushi for my birthday. I wouldn't have even known they existed. But because they were sat there on the menu, nestled between the cool games, I gave them a go. And suddenly, I wasn't just a kid who liked shooters. I was a kid who liked everything. It broadened our horizons at a time when our world felt quite small. It made us brave gamers. We weren't afraid to try something weird or foreign because the cost of failure was zero. If the game was rubbish, you didn't feel cheated. You just moved on to the next icon. It encouraged a give it a go attitude. That has stayed with me throughout the entire PSX Index project. When I look at a weird, obscure title now, I don't see a hurdle. I see that same spark of potential I felt in 1998. We were a generation of sample artists. We took little bits of culture from all over the world, Japanese RPGs, American sports sims, European races, and we mashed them together into a single childhood experience. We didn't have the budget to be narrow-minded. Scarcity made us explorers, and the demo disc was our compass.
What people will do for a little entertainment system. It's midnight. I'm here for the PlayStation 2.
Then almost overnight, the plastic sleeves stopped appearing, the high street shifted, the internet arrived with its 56k screeches and eventually its broadband convenience, and suddenly the idea of pressing a physical disc to give away a sample seemed like an ancient expensive relic. By the time the PS2 was in full swing, the demo disc was grasping its last breath, and by the PS3, it was dead and buried in the digital storefront. But something fundamental was lost in that transition. When you download a demo today, it's a clinical transaction. You click a button, a progress bar crawls across the screen, and the file sits in a silent library. There's no weight to it, there's no ritual. You haven't walked into the shop, you haven't felt the crinkle of the plastic, and you haven't held a physical piece of the future in your hands. The tactile experiment was the real magic. Holding that disc felt like you were holding a secret. It was a physical manifestation of what's next. When we moved to the digital download, we lost the curation. Now you're drowning in choice, but none of it feels special. You don't have an editor choosing 10 weird games for you to try. You just have an algorithm trying to sell you a battle pass. I miss the trash that came with the treasures. In the digital age, if a demo isn't for a AAA blockbuster, you probably won't even see it. But the physical discs forced you to acknowledge the mid-tier games, the weird experiments, and the absolute failures. You couldn't just scroll past them. They were right there, physically etched into the same silver circle as your favourite games. The death of the physical sample was the death of the event. It turned gaming from a cultural moment you shared with your mates in a bedroom into a solitary act of consumption. We traded the plastic sleeve for the instant download, but I'm not sure it was a fair swap. We got convenience, but we lost the architecture of discovery. Now, these discs are just e-waste in the eyes of the world, sitting in dusty boxes in charity shops or being sold for pennies on eBay. But to us, they're time machines. They're the only physical proof we have of a time when the industry was still figuring itself out. A time when a 10-minute timer and a blurry texture were enough to keep us occupied for an entire month. We weren't just collecting discs, we were collecting the keys to a world that was still being built.
Time to sit back and take it all in, because PlayStation's gonna lift you up by the seat of your bagged-out britches and launch you straight into the rabid mouth of fully interactive You Participate magazine.
Call 1-800-983-SONY. Get 4 issues, 8 CDs for only $29.95. Get it today.
When I sit down to record the PSX Index every week, I'm essentially trying to recapture the feeling of these Saturday afternoons in 1998. The project is just one massive, never-ending demo disc. Every time I boot up a new entry, whether it's a legendary RPG or a racing game that barely functions, I'm looking for that same spark of what's this then that I felt when I was 10 years old tearing open a magazine. We're living in an era of the complete edition. Everything is patched, polished and presented as a finished product. But the demo disc taught us to love the unfinished. It taught us that the game doesn't have to be perfect to be memorable. You can have a life-changing experience in 10 minutes, even if you never see the ending, even if you never beat the boss, and even if you're not good enough to get past the first level. Those little tasters were the foundation of how we see games. They gave us a sense of variety that felt like a superpower. We weren't just players, we were witnesses to the growth of the medium. We saw the experiments, the failures, and the accidental masterpieces long before they became classics. And while the physical discs might be rotting away in lofts or sitting in the bargain bins of history, the impact they left on our brains is permanent. The demo disc paradox is simple. We remember the games we didn't own just as clearly as the ones we did. We remember the timers, the menu music, and the frustrations of the thank you for playing screen, because these moments were shared. They were the joy of a time when gaming felt like a secret club we were all invited to, regardless of our budget. So next time when you're scrolling through a digital storefront with 10,000 games at your fingertips and nothing to play, try to remember the plastic sleeve, remember the 10-minute timer, remember the excitement of having just one level of one game, and how that was more than enough to fuel your imagination for a month. The index continues, but there's still so much left to discover. We're not just documenting software, we're documenting the way these games made us feel when the world was a bit smaller, the consoles were a bit louder, and every disc was a gamble worth taking. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next PSX Index entry, and maybe just until then, go on that PlayStation Store, pick one game you've never heard of, and just give it a little try.